Donald Trump has not been quiet about his claims that the election is being rigged. But what evidence is there? Our nightly political panel is here. Byron York, chief political correspondent at the Washington Examiner, and Nina Easton, Fortune magazine. Nina? So he says it's being rigged. He says he has suggested that it would be rigged in the election itself on election day and before, but he has sometimes refined that to say, well, what he's talking about is it's being rigged by the media. So has he got a case here in your judgment?
A couple things. One is we had Ivanka Trump on stage at our Fortune event in Laguna this week, the day of the debate, and she, as one of his surrogates, made the case that it's rigged by the media and that he would accept the results of the election. So he has his surrogate saying one thing while he's drilling down more harshly on this voter fraud issue. Is there voter fraud? Yeah, there's instances of voter fraud, but there isn't widespread rigged election type voter fraud that would swing an election, particularly a 4 or 5 or 6% presidential, national presidential election.
Certainly, when the kind of voter fraud that we hear about, with some numbers of voters either voting illegally or votes allegedly being changed or being bussed in from out of state, sound like the kind of numbers that could make a difference in a local election, particularly, possibly a congressional district election, right, maybe in a statewide election. Byron, your thoughts?
Well, when he talks about the system being rigged, sometimes when he talks about the election being rigged, sometimes he talks about the system being rigged. Most of it is about the media, and there is, in fact, a lot of bias against Trump. I just don't think there's any doubt about that. But this is one of these statements that Trump has made that his surrogates have to go out and explain all the time. Well, he's not really talking about actual voter fraud. And then Trump says, yes, I am. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So, I mean, there is some of it. But the idea, the day after the debate, he goes to Ohio and says, of course I would accept the results of a clear election, the clear results of an election. But if it were really close, blah, blah, blah. And we have seen a really close election.
Well, I mean, it's perfectly reasonable for him to say that if the election was close and questionable, as he has also said.
And he could have said that at the debate.
That's, well, my point.
But let's look at one example that he does say, and he pulls out. He says he took from a study that there's 1.8 million Americans who are dead on the records. On the voter record.
Registered to vote. Dead but registered to vote.
Dead but registered to vote. So, yes, that's true that a study found that. But the study also found that there's absolutely no evidence that those names were used
to vote.
And yet he says, well, what those 1.8 million people are going to be voting against me.
Yeah, so they're going to climb out of their graves and vote?
Yeah, he uses this sort of piecemeal approach to the studies that have been done.
I've often been wondering about that because people tell me all these illegitimate people on the rolls are voting, dead people are on the rolls to vote. But how do you vote them? I mean, you have to have other people take their names.
They're taking their names, and again, there are weaknesses in the system, and this is why I support voter ID laws. I think that the states need to do more to clean up their voter registration rolls. There's some weaknesses in the system. But is there widespread rigging that's going to swing an election that could be 4 or 5 or 6 percentage points on a national level?
And it only matters if it's super, super close.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's like Florida 2000.
That's what Bush v. Gore showed us, is that the system cannot deal with such fine differences. If you have 10 million votes, to have 500 of them be the margin of victory, right, it's almost impossible to get a precise count of that. And the polls right now tell us it's not going to be close.
Yeah, that's
no single state will determine the Electoral College.
But the Bush-Gore example does show that you can get a race close enough to where a few hundred votes could make a difference. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And don't go away.